Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, no distractions. After last week's almost complete lack of progress, we are now setting course for the end of Chapter 5 of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, and neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night, I will not get distracted. I will not get distracted by this thought. Nothing, no digression, no temptation, no parenthetical aside is going to distract us from making progress through this genuinely brilliant, fantastic book, which we are reading here tonight on the first night of autumnal weather here in the great state of Oklahoma that we've had so far this year. There are thunderstorms on the horizon, and frankly, it's an enormous relief to be in this position, as you can tell from my seasonal flannel here this evening. It's so much more fun when I make these proclamations about not getting distracted right at the top of the show, only to immediately derail myself. Tonight, then, we're going to look at identity, we're going to look at isolation, we're going to look at community, we're going to look at truth in a really interesting way, and how such things are defined. But before we get to that, a promised and very necessary digression into the American Gothic tradition and how The Haunting of Hill House sits within that tradition, because it is a really interesting, almost postmodern point of inflection with the history, the progression of Gothic literature as a whole. As we discussed in last week's show, Gothic literature, you know, in addition to all of the stylistic elements with which we're all familiar, wind-blasted moors and ancient castles and dark and stormy nights, etc., etc., Gothic literature is really about the intrusion of the past into the present. It's an exploration. It's an exposing of the ways in which our modern world, our rational world, our intellectual world, in some ways our masculine world, is a facade. It is an illusion. It is a water membrane bubble against which we are all set against the ancient things of the world, right? We are vulnerable even within our sense of safety and security, questions which are going to be extremely important as we move through The Haunting of Hill House. We are vulnerable to the deepest antiquity. We are vulnerable to all that has been in the past, which outnumbers us a great many to one. Let me call up our first slide here just to distract from my own appearance here on camera. This, of course, is the beautiful Whitby Abbey, known to us best, I'm sure, from our Dracula unit. So Gothic literature arises in the 18th century, coupled with that other great anti-rationalist artistic movement, Romanticism. They come up together. In fact, you can see a lot of overlap, I think, in the way that Gothic literature and Romantic literature generate friction and conflict and thematic depth. Both are focused on the past, either in this, somber, unsettling mystery of the Gothic past, or the bucolic Arcadian sense of the Romantic past, the simplicity and ease of the Romantic imagination. The past, Gothic literature tells us, cannot be escaped. It cannot be deterred. It cannot even really be understood, and it is coming for you with terror and with horror and with madness. And American writers in the 19th century take this rich tradition and infuse it with some particularly American preoccupations with the culture of their own circumstance, as every writer inevitably does. This includes, of course, the founding paradox of the colonized United States, this carefully, painstakingly maintained cleanliness of the Puritan way of life, the purity of the Puritan way of life, contrasted ruthlessly with the often sexualized violence of the colonial act. And if you're skeptical about that particular connection, consider how many times you've heard references to the great open spaces of America being quote-unquote virgin lands that can be claimed and conquered, possessed and exploited. And that's without seeing the frontier as a place of mystery, a place of the past, which would test the moral mettle of the Puritan spirit, where here we're kind of tying into the ideas of Romanticism again. There is something passionate about the frontier. There is something animalistic. There is something bestial about the frontier. When you are out there connected to the wilderness, rather than being safe and clean and carefully sanctioned in your own civil environment, when you're out there and there's no one telling you what you can or cannot do, then we are all a little closer to the wild. We're all a little closer to the darkness. At least this is the American Gothic literary imaginary in operation. This is what gets us directly to, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and ultimately to the work of Edgar Allan Poe, who is paradoxically seen by many as the creator of a genre that has, by the time that he starts writing, been around for about 80 years. Let's take a look here at Poe. The other thing that happens through the Victorian period, and this has particular applicability to American Gothic literature, though it does take place in mainstream Gothic literature too, is the more frequent inclusion of the abhuman, the non-human, the semi-human figure at the heart of the story, the monstrous figure. This gives us Dracula, of course, but also werewolves and Mr. Hyde and so on and so forth. All of the monsters of the Victorian imaginary come from, well, the abhuman figure in general is partly developed from the works of scholars like Darwin, who positions human beings as a part of the natural world, right? As elevated animals rather than earthbound angels, in a way that is disquieting to many. If we're only slightly elevated and not categorically different from the beasts of the field, then are we not potentially at least subject to the same bestial nature? Are we not in some way still animals? And if we are, how do we balance this desire for civilization, desire for society, desire to separate ourselves from our roots, which is, of course, the original sin of Gothic literature in the first place? And in the Americas, of course, well, not just in the Americas, sadly, but particularly in the Americas, the rendering of the native populations and slave populations as abhuman themselves, almost human, but monstrously not, is a common feature of the colonial narrative. This leads us directly, A to B to C, to the specifically Gothic racism of writers like H.P. Lovecraft. And if Americans, haunted by the original sin of their nation, stricken with guilt and fear and their own atavistic animalism, if they paper this over with Puritanism and with civility, if those Americans find reflection in Gothic literature, then how much more true must that be of the South, particularly, though not exclusively, after the Civil War? The ruin of the Confederate South, let me advance here to not a picture, in fact, of the American South, but let me present to you here the famous piece of art, American Gothic, painted by Grant Wood in 1930, an evocation not actually of Gothic literature in the modern sense. There is not supposed to be a horror element to this painting, and yet, of course, many find a horror element in its disquieting candor. There is something very both direct and enormously elusive about Grant's work, which is why it has become such an icon of the American Gothic movement. So, to move away from this, to return to the Confederate South for just a moment, the ruin of the South, economically and politically and culturally and socially and ideologically, finds resonance in the conventions of Gothic fiction, because we're situating those stories not in echoing castles on a windswept cliff or ancient manor houses on a withered heath, but in the decaying plantation houses of the South. Southern Gothic literature, fascinatingly, often tries to reconcile the sins of the fathers, which is to say, not just the violence done to preserve the antebellum South, but the lies upon which the antebellum South are founded, with the idea that the contemporary South has now also been isolated as an abhuman subculture itself, left behind to rot in the rain. We get a lot of villains in disguise in Southern fiction, which is going to be directly relevant to our discussion tonight. We get a lot of good people clinging to a shred of decency and moral rectitude in the against the winds, against the storms, against the tidal waves of a world that wants to break them, wants to tempt them, wants to force them into the abyss. We get Tennessee Williams and Flannery O'Connor and Faulkner, of course, but not, I would argue, as I did last week, The Haunting of Hill House. Hill House does not quite belong to that expressly Southern Gothic tradition, but the American Gothic, absolutely. We can position The Haunting of Hill House as a reflection on the America of the 20th century, right? This is a post-war America. It's 1959 when Jackson publishes this book. And we can see, I think, an active engagement with both the Gothic tradition of American literature anyway, particularly American horror literature at that point, as well as this postmodern interrogation of the ideas which underpin our own approach to literature in the first place. Why do we think that stories work the way that they do? That is a product of ideology, right? That is a product of the stories that we have been told. We have taken them, we have abstracted from them the rules of narrative as we understand them, and we continue to apply those forward, crucially not just to other stories, but to the experiences of our own lives. That's something we're going to focus on today as we get into it. We have Hugh joining us here from Zambia and Rachel joining us from Australia. It is very good to have you both here with me This evening, as I say, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so I hope that, well, frankly, I hope that I don't get too distracted, and I hope that the thunder doesn't interrupt my internet connection in any way tonight, but we'll see how it goes. Let's get right into our reading now. We're picking up from the very beginning of Chapter 2. We covered the beginning of Chapter 2 last week. We have arrived at Hill House. We have introduced ourselves to Theodora, and we're now out behind the house itself, out in this odd little, this dell, this fairy space that's out here, liminally on the outskirts of the estate. And we're comparing life stories, I guess. Let's get into our first slide here. Theodora opened one eye. Did you used to have a comic uncle? Everyone always laughed whatever he said, and he used to tell you not to be afraid of the bull. If the bull came after you, all you had to do was grab the ring through his nose and swing him around your head. Eleanor tossed a pebble into the brook and watched it sink clearly to the bottom. Did you have a lot of uncles? Thousands. Do you? After a minute, Eleanor said, oh, yes, big ones and little ones and fat ones and thin ones. Do you have an Aunt Edna? Aunt Muriel. Kind of thin, rimless glasses? A garnet brooch, Eleanor said. Does she wear a kind of dark red dress to family parties? Lace cuffs. Then I think we must really be related, Theodora said. So, look at what's happening here, right? Both women are manufacturing this connection by identifying a kind of commonality in difference, right? We are simultaneously pointing out the fact that they have nothing in common, right? The specifics here are wrong. They are different, or at least are ambiguous, right? Do you have an Aunt Edna? No, she doesn't have an Aunt Edna, but she does have an Aunt Muriel. And that's not the same, but it's also not completely different. Does this aunt, is she kind of thin? Does she wear rimless glasses? No, neither of those things, but she does wear a garnet brooch. And again, not the same, but also not completely different. They don't share the same experiences, but they imagine that they do. And Theodora says, ultimately, of course, that she is now positive that they are cousins. And there's no suggestion that this is so. I don't mean literally, of course, right? It would be ridiculous to suggest that this catalog of unshared experiences suggests anything of the kind. But what's unclear is whether or not Theodora and Eleanor are trying earnestly and sincerely to connect with each other, if there's a kind of formality to this dance, if this is just a kind of small talk that out there on the fringes of these shared connections, we really are, interpreting something. Oh, and as he was asking here in the chat, or is this 1950s style flirting? Certainly that is another option too, right? And there's also the idea that they could be drenched in irony. They could just be saturated in a kind of 2000s Gen X version of irony, right? You can imagine the Garden State Diablo Cody version of this scene where they're just achingly aware that everything they're saying is kind of discontinuous with what was just said. This is going to be significant later. This choosing to establish the relationship in defiance of the absent details, both the absent details themselves and the fact that this is seen as a foundation for a long-lasting relationship. Here, he was asking in the chat, what are their ages? As we know, explicitly, Eleanor is 32 years old, though she will lie about that and so many other things in the course of this week's reading. She will claim, for no good reason, as the narrative voice points out, for no good reason, that she is in fact 34. I'm not sure that we get an age for Theodora. Is she younger? I read her, I guess, as younger, but of course, so much of the relationship between Eleanor and Theodora is loaded with a kind of, well, obviously, right, there is a kind of romantic spark happening here. There is arguably, possibly a sexual spark happening here. There's some kind of attraction between the two of them. But there is also very much this kind of competition. There is also this kind of, early wave feminism kind of pushback against the idea that women can have simple relationships, that women's relationships with one another are always poisoned by men. That's one of the things that we're going to be looking for, even in the absence of actual, agency on the part of the man in their lives. We're going to look a little bit at that this evening. So we're introduced from there to Luke Sanderson, the someday inheritor of this house and estate, and Dr. Montague in person. As they arrive at the house, we settle in for the first of what is going to be an extended series of long conversations, all of them aided and abetted by martinis and brandy. And we're going to really pick up here, to continue, I guess, from this question that we're looking at on the slide right here, this first scene between Theodora and Eleanor, about what it is that constitutes identity and how we understand the puzzle pieces of any individual identity. Let's take a look at the next slide. They were sitting in a small room, chosen by the doctor, who had led them into it, down a narrow corridor, fumbling a little at first, but then finding his way. It was not a cozy room, certainly. It had an unpleasantly high ceiling and a narrow tiled fireplace which looked chill in spite of the fire which Luke had lighted at once. The chairs in which they sat were rounded and slippery, and the light coming through the coloured beaded shades of the lamp sent shadows into the corners. The overwhelming sense of the room was purple. Beneath their feet, the carpeting glowed in dim, convoluted patterns. The walls were papered and gilt, and a marble cupid beamed fatuously down at them from the mantel. When they were silent for a moment, the quiet weight of the house pressed down from all around them. Eleanor, wondering if she were really here at all and not dreaming of Hill House from some safe spot impossibly remote, looked slowly and carefully around the room, telling herself that this was real. These things existed, from the tiles around the fireplace to the marble cupid. These people were going to be her friends. The doctor was round and rosy and bearded, and looked as though he might be more suitably established before a fire in a pleasant little sitting room with a cat on his knee and a rosy little wife to bring him jellied scones. And yet he was undeniably the Dr. Montague who had guided Eleanor here, a little man both knowledgeable and stubborn. Across the fire from the doctor was Theodora, who had gone unerringly to the most nearly comfortable chair, had wriggled herself into it somehow with her legs over the arm and her head tucked in against the back. She was like a cat, Eleanor thought, and clearly a cat waiting for its dinner. Luke was not still for a minute, but moved back and forth across the shadows, filling glasses, stirring the fire, touching the marble cupid. He was bright in the firelight and restless. They were all silent, looking into the fire, lazy after their several journeys, and Eleanor thought, I am the fourth person in this room. I am one of them. I belong. So this extends into our game of improvisational Guess Who, right? In which every member of the party is denoted by these specific characteristics tied to their names. Eleanor wears a red sweater, thus the woman wearing yellow must be Theodora. Dr. Montague has a beard, thus the man without a beard must be Luke. And through that extension of this core argument, I think we see that these characters are, Eleanor feels herself to be, the product of the things which define her. The simple handshake, small talk communication between Theodora and Eleanor outside, which we saw in the previous slide, right? This exchanging of small pieces of information as a means of establishing intimacy, as a means of establishing sincerity. This is a product of small talk. This is one of the things that small talk accomplishes. It is a very useful kind of social lubricant, though, yes, exhausting in its excess, perhaps. But that is what is happening, right? We are passing pieces of social capital back and forth in order to establish not just our own sense of internal hierarchy, not just the sense of the dynamic relationship between us, but also this sense of intimacy, this sense that there is now, by exchanging these meaningless tokens of information, there is now a relationship between us, right? The exchange itself is the point. But here we're developing that idea still further. We're looking at this idea that these things which define us give us shape. They give us a kind of totality. They give us a kind of identity, right? So we are the product of the things which define us, but we are also defined, just as defined, we might argue, by the things that we are not. We are defined in opposition to others. Theodora is defined as the woman who is not wearing red. Luke is defined as the man who does not have a beard. In turn, Eleanor and Theodora together are defined as those people who are not men, right? That's an implicit. It's interesting that Jackson doesn't even shine a light on the gender dynamic that's happening here, which is an interesting kind of open question, I think, as we move through the entirety of the book, quite frankly, particularly given Jackson's own interaction with her husband, which we discussed in last week's show. We talked a lot about exactly how traditional gender roles were being subverted throughout their entire marriage, and their consciousness of that subversion, and the fact that the subversion itself did not seem to convey or possess an innate value for Jackson and Hyman, right? I'm curious, moving forward through this book, what you guys make of the absence of gender dynamics as they're presented. We certainly get some, right? This is not to suggest that there is no discussion of gender or no positioning of characters as being primarily gendered in the course of this book, but it is underplayed in a way that, here are the options, right? In a way that is either very interesting and progressive because Jackson is choosing not to focus her attention on those specific qualities, those specific identity tokens of any of the individuals involved, or, and I do think this is probably more likely, the book is a product of her cultural ideology. The book is assuming these gender dynamics because these gender dynamics are standard and stable at the point at which she is writing it. Exactly as Hugh said, some of the gender dynamics are skewed because it's the 1950s. I think that's a very appropriate a very appropriate kind of reading. He was also noting that the house will resist them being comfortable. Isn't that fantastic through this? It's the room itself is inherently uncomfortable. And I find, I know that there are critics out there are readers of this book who really love the way that the rooms are color-coded and just bedecked, just lavished in soft furnishings. I am not like an over-the-top soft furnishings guy personally, right? It's not that I'm against them, you understand. I'll embrace a cushion, certainly, from time to time, but all of the, the tassels and the damask and everything else that fills this house, I find that stuff really off-putting. I find it really, really genuinely upsetting. I don't think there is a description of a single room in this entire house that I find anything other than just really off-putting and upsetting. So here, as I say, just to kind of circle around on this, we get these tokens of identity being passed around again, less voluntarily this time. Here we are seeing some of these tokens of identity taking shape, taking their form in opposition to other characters in the room. But ultimately, look at where we arrive. Here, right, we get the description of Dr. Montague looking as though he should be cozier, even though he is, he's brilliant and crucially stubborn. Then we get the description of Theodora, who has found immediately the most comfortable chair out of the uncomfortable chairs in the room and settled in it like a cat. And immediately, of course, Eleanor conveys that to a cat waiting for its dinner, right? How you interpret that depends very much, I think, on your opinion of cats. And even at this early stage, on your opinion of Theodora, too. Is she saying that this cat is a quietly domestic cat who is waiting to be fed passively, right? Is maybe a little indulgent, is maybe a little lazy, certainly, right? Or is she thinking of the essential nature of cats, hunters, predators here? And then there's Luke, who is so active, who is so present in the room, who is moving around in a way that the others aren't, right? Moving back and forth across the shadows, moving in front of the fireplace, so casting shadows himself too, filling glasses, stirring the fire, touching the marble cupid, as we learn, making a fair at best martini using too much vermouth. They're all silent, looking into the fire, lazy after their several journeys, and Eleanor thought, I am the fourth person in this room. I am one of them. I belong. So for all of this exchange of tokened identity, Eleanor is arriving at the right place. She is one of them. If at least we buy this as a sincere moment of reflection from Eleanor and not an attempt to convince herself. We're going to talk more about Eleanor's positioning, or the positioning of Eleanor's POV with regard to the book as a whole, in just a little while. I'm not going to spend too much time on the next passage, which is the long story of the history of the house. We can gloss it just in case it has fallen out of your memories here. Constructed by... This is terrible, right? A character named Hugh Crane, a name that I cannot read without interpreting it as a joke about the Eastern European country, the former Soviet Republic, now at war with Russia, right? The guy who built this house is called Ukraine. That's a very strange thing. I don't think that is deliberate, and I don't think that it possesses any meaning. It just causes me to stumble every time I read the complete name. We get the story of the construction of the house and the death of Crane's first wife, with two more to follow, we are told. He raises his daughters in the house, which inspires us to draw connections between, Eleanor and Carrie, her sister, and Eleanor and Theodora, of course. The elder sister, a spinster, takes in a companion from the town of Hillsdale. Queer readings, absolutely applicable right here. And when she dies, there is a protracted legal battle between the companion and the younger sister. And I will actually pause there not to breeze right over the queer reading that is happening here, right? Because this is obviously very loaded here. Being present here in 2025, we're obviously thinking a great deal about the kinds of relationships that people are permitted by the state to have. A sentence that I never thought I would have to utter again, for sure. But here we have a position where the elder spinster, commonly used as shorthand for someone who is themselves queer, right, takes in this companion, and then we have the protracted legal battle because the younger sister, the disinherited younger sister, argues that the elder sister could never have wanted the companion, her employee, to inherit the house. But of course, our queer reading might suggest that there was a much more intimate relationship between the two. The companion, in any case, wins the case and eventually leaves the house anyway because of nocturnal visitors and general disturbances, which may or may not be supernatural. So then we cut ahead to after we get the explanation of the history of Hill House in its entirety, right, which is a long passage for sure, we get the sequence of Eleanor relaxing by the fire. And this is our third beat in terms of our tokens of identity. This is the last opportunity to discuss this evening, I think. Let me see if I can advance this slide. There it is. Eleanor found herself unexpectedly admiring her own feet. Theodora dreamed over the fire just beyond the tips of her toes, and Eleanor thought with deep satisfaction that her feet were handsome in their red sandals. What a complete and separate thing I am, she thought, going from my red toes to the top of my head, individually an I, possessed of attributes belonging only to me. I have red shoes, she thought. That goes with being Eleanor. I dislike lobster and sleep on my left side and crack my knuckles when I am nervous and save buttons. I am holding a brandy glass, which is mine because I am here and I am using it and I have a place in this room. I have red shoes, and tomorrow I will wake up and I will still be here. I have red shoes, she said very softly, and Theodora turned and smiled up at her. I had intended, and the doctor looked around at them with bright, anxious optimism, I had intended to ask if you all played bridge. Of course, Eleanor said. I play bridge, she thought. I used to have a cat named Dancer. I can swim. So here again, right? We're running through these tokens. We're running through these elements of identity. We're coming up with these things which constitute an Eleanor, right? to be an Eleanor is to have red shoes, is to dislike lobster, is to sleep on her left side, and to crack her knuckles when she is nervous. Now, is any of that necessary to being an Eleanor? Would she still be an Eleanor? Would she? I guess I shouldn't add the. I shouldn't add the article there, right? Because that really does change the impression of the question. If Eleanor no longer liked lobster, would Eleanor be Eleanor? Would Eleanor be a different Eleanor? What is the definitional quality of that particular piece of information about Eleanor? To what extent is it necessary? To what extent is it a essential piece, a core building block of Eleanor? And to what extent is it irrelevant? And if there are irrelevant tokens of identity, then what does that mean for our sense of ourselves? Here, as Eleanor is thinking, what a complete and separate thing I am, right? She's thinking, I am all of these disparate things that I have just discussed. I crack my knuckles when I am nervous. That is a thing about her. But what if she didn't? Would she herself be different? So we're developing still further here this philosophy of identity. You are the combination of the product of all the things which are you, and that collection of things becomes greater than the sum of its parts. So what happens, we must wonder, when we transition to the next slide and discover Eleanor lying about who she is? What is your apartment like? Theodora shrugged. Nice, she said. We found an old place and fixed it up ourselves. One big room and a couple of small bedrooms, nice kitchen. We painted it red and white and made over a lot of old furniture we dug up in junk shops. One really nice table with a marble top. We both love doing over old things. Are you married? Eleanor asked. There was a little silence, and then Theodora laughed quickly and said, No. Sorry, Eleanor said, horribly embarrassed. I didn't mean to be curious. You're funny, Theodora said, and touched Eleanor's cheek with her finger. There are lines by my eyes, Eleanor thought, and turned her face away from the fire. Tell me where you live, Theodora said. Eleanor thought, looking down at her hands, which were badly shaped. We could have afforded a laundress, she thought. It wasn't fair. My hands are awful. I have a little place of my own, she said slowly. An apartment, like yours, only I live alone. Smaller than yours, I'm sure. I'm still furnishing it, buying one thing at a time, to make sure I get everything absolutely right. White curtains. I had to look for weeks before I found my little stone lions on each corner of the mantel. And I have a white cat and my books and records and pictures. Everything has to be exactly the way I want it because there's only me to use it. Once I had a blue cup with stars painted on the inside. When you looked down into a cup of tea, it was full of stars. I want a cup like that. So, first, again, queer reading in full force. We are again circling back to the idea that Theodora is not sharing an apartment with someone in the sense that they are in a financial relationship. She's sharing an apartment with someone in the sense that they are in a domestic, romantic, sexual relationship. We can see that, I think, very clearly here with this beat of, are you married? Eleanor asked. There was a little silence, and then Theodora laughed quickly and said, no. Because, of course, that would have been an impossibility at the time. And here, Eleanor clearly does not understand that. Eleanor has no traction with that in that moment. But still, it is present, I think, clear to the reader here. He was asking, I wondered if the house is normally in a passive state, but it takes a particular person, mind, to activate it, bring it to life. Hugh, I think that what you have done there is put your finger on the great unanswered and perhaps unanswerable question of The Haunting of Hill House. We were going to talk about this in just a slide or two's time anyway, so I'm absolutely happy to jump into it right now. But there is a whole continuity, a spectrum of response to this book based on whether or not you think, A, whether or not anything supernatural is happening, and B, what is the nature of that supernatural event? Is the house haunted, right? Even the ambiguity in the title of the book, The Haunting of Hill House, right? Not just the passive voice that we've observed before, but the fact that it is ambiguous as to who or what is doing the haunting. We are almost encouraged, I think, to see the appearance of Eleanor, the arrival of Eleanor into the house as being a kind of haunting, particularly in the kind of pre-Shakespearean mode of that word. So is there anything supernatural happening? And if so, does it derive externally from forces within the house or internally from something that Eleanor or another of these guests or some combination of these guests have brought with them? Or is it some combination of all of those factors? There is a kind of austere, kind of cynical, very postmodern reading of the book, postmodern in the literary sense, right? That in fact, nothing happens in this book, that in fact there is no supernatural quality to Hill House whatsoever, that the depiction of Dr. Montague is parodic, right? That it is a satire oriented at him, that we are too deep in Eleanor's POV to know if anything really happens in the house, and what there is could be explained in a number of different ways, either by the deceit and deception of Dr. Montague himself, perhaps some kind of attempt to intimidate these visitors by the Dudleys, right? There are other explanations that can be offered. There's these people who take this very austere reading. I myself am not one of them, but these people who take this very austere reading will tell you that in fact there is no concrete evidence for anything happening in the book. Now, I think that you take that kind of line too far at your peril. I think that what you are doing ultimately, if you pursue that to its ultimate manifestation, you get to things like, well, there's no such place as Hill House. There's no such character as Eleanor Vance. Did you know that these are just words written down on a page made up by someone? None of it is true. Nothing could be true. You know, you just take this nihilistic approach to the whole idea of narrative in the first place, which obviously is not where I'm at myself. But if you accept that supernatural phenomena are occurring within the house, if you accept that strange things are afoot, and you can choose, you know, which ones of those you think are anything at all. I think that we're led to believe that the cold spot by the nursery door is pretty objective, right? But also things like mass hysteria exist. So I don't know. Maybe you can even write that off too. But if you are inclined to believe that something supernatural is happening, then you are really, I think, prompting the question. You are forcing the question. You are compelling the question of, are these supernatural qualities and events innate to the house, or are these the consequence of something that Eleanor or another character brings with them into the house? I think there is something really interesting about the interplay between both Eleanor and Theodora. I think that the way that Eleanor and Theodora are positioned in the course of the book are, you know, you'll remember, of course, that they are the explicitly supernatural people, right? Theodora has this ESP, this telepathy, whatever it is, right? She has this kind of psychic power that was attested in the lab results, and Eleanor has, as is brought up in this week's reading, she has the encounter with the pelting stones when she's a child, even though she doesn't take that to be or understand that to be supernatural in any way. They are both the results of Dr. Montague's research. So they are here, and it is interesting to question, as we look at the friction between these two women, how the supernatural, the paranormal manifestations of the house kind of reflect and play into their dynamic very specifically. You know, we'll have the opportunity to talk about that in just a few minutes as we get there. I wanted to pull up, let me call back to this slide, in fact. Oh no, excuse me, not this slide. Oh no, this is, I was thinking of the lines around the eyes, but but it's actually the hands that are badly shaped here, right? As she's thinking about, this is the critical self voice, right? We get the lines around the eyes, we get the badly shaped hands. We could have afforded a laundress. It wasn't fair. My hands are awful. Her hands have been punished by years and years and years of laundry in the service of her ailing and decrepit mother. And we'll get much more of this the following morning before Eleanor's critical self-voice begins to spin out into the anxious belief that the people around her are secretly critical of her, contemptuous of her, dismissive of her. More on that, obviously, as we move forward. For now, though, what I want to consider is why Eleanor would lie under these circumstances, and more importantly, perhaps, what the consequences are for her identity if these markers of being are fluid or fabricated. How is this fabricated version of Eleanor distinct from the versions we've seen previously, if indeed it is? Does the lie about the cup of stars, the recycling of this encounter, even by proxy, with the cup of stars, right? She can't even quite maintain to the end of the passage. When you look down into a cup of tea, it was full of stars. I want a cup like that. I had a blue cup. This is the extent of her lie. Not I have this cup with stars in it. It's that I once had one, and by implication now I don't, and I want one again. That's what it is. It's this moment of connection there back to this fabricated past. So does the lie about the cup of stars contrast with the playful fantasies that the girls share during their time outside, or with the men during their first meeting, or the many fantasies that Eleanor indulges in during her journey to the house in the first place? And just to expand this one step further, to expand it, I think, to the final step, to take it as far as the book will permit us to take it, perhaps just as importantly, how do we understand these fantasies, these lies and fictions, certainly, that Eleanor creates, but in general, to incorporate everything that is kind of counterfactual that Eleanor is asserting to be true here and earlier in the book too? How do we understand these fantasies in the context of the dreaming, which even larks and katydids are supposed by some to do, per the first chapter of the book? Is there a way in which this fictionalizing of her own life, this almost plagiarism of her own experience, I suppose, is a means of remaining sane in the face of absolute reality, right? That is why, you'll remember from that opening paragraph, that is why the larks and the katydids are said to dream, because they are sane. They are not consumed, their sanity is not consumed or subverted or overwhelmed by the stark reality of the universe. The dreaming there gives you something back. And is that, we must ask, what Eleanor is doing? So we conclude chapter 3 with everyone retiring for the evening, and then we get this great cinematic move with Eleanor pulling the blanket over her head and Theodora sleeping with the light on, right? You can imagine the panning shot as the camera moves through the wall into the next room as we see them in succession, right? Eleanor has the blanket over her head in the dark. Theodora is sleeping with the light on. Montague is cozily reading Pamela. Just some drive-by shots taken at Pamela in this book, which I really enjoy. Luke is sleeping, we're told, with a flashlight and his lucky piece, which I just read today. Some people take this to be a gun, as though Luke is a, dime novel detective guy, right? He's sleeping with a flashlight and a gun on his nightstand. I do not think that the quote-unquote lucky piece is a gun, not least of all because if it were foreshadowed, as Chekhov tells us, it would definitely show up at the end of the book. Instead, per 1950s slang, I think this lucky piece is a lucky coin. It's usually a nickel that is supposed to bring both a kind of general luck and the flow of more money to the owner. But it does tell us something still, nonetheless, right? It tells us that Luke is superstitious. Luke is perhaps still guarded, still protected by this facade of superstition that allows him, in his way, to dream and remain sane in the face of, well, I'm gesturing at everything, right? Then, what is even more brilliant, right? We get this panning shot, this literary cinematic panning shot across the 4 residents of the house, and then we zoom all the way out to see Mrs. Dudley having that moment of awareness of the house and then forcing herself back to sleep, which is brilliant. We get Mrs. Sanderson, the owner of the house. We get a glimpse of Theodora's nameless friend. We get Mrs. Montague. We get Eleanor's sister, Carrie. It is just this bravura, brilliant moment of literary accomplishment right there at the end of the chapter, really situating the isolation of Hill House, but also concomitantly, right, the unity and community of the 4 residents of Hill House right now. They are together, and that means something. We skip into chapter 4, as I say, with Eleanor beginning her day with some self-loathing and the anxious belief that she has done something terrible the night before. And I mean, who among us, right? I don't think that, partly because of where this story goes, I don't think that Jackson gets enough credit for the depiction of what we would now recognize, I think, as some kind of anxiety disorder, right? It is clear that Eleanor has a really broken relationship with her own sense of identity, with her own sense of her past. We get that because I skipped right over it, but that moment of her recognizing that her hands are ugly or are badly shaped, If that is true, then she is actually, dare we say, right to be angry that they could have afforded a laundress and instead she was put to work, and that has taken something from her. You know, there's an element there of honesty and connection, and it's 4 layers deep. So we don't know what the origin point of that is or how sure we can be of Eleanor's description there, but still, nonetheless. Oh, Hugh is telling me here, in the 1950s in the USA, a lucky piece was a type of good luck charm that could be almost any small object, such as a special coin or a token from a specific event. These items were kept for their supposed power to bring good fortune. Thank you, Hugh. Excellent. Okay, so we're agreed, not a gun. We're agreed that Luke is not packing heat through the back half of this novel. I feel good about that. I feel positively relaxed about that, honestly. So the bulk of this chapter is taken up by this explanation of the layout of the house, which is deliberately deceptive, right? We even get the note here about the Winchester Mystery House, which if you haven't ever looked up pictures of that, I urge you to do so. It is bizarre. We are told that every angle is a few degrees off. It's designed to create this deliberately bewildering, maddening effect that it is a spatial joke presented to the people who inhabit the house, which I must admit is maybe the most upsetting thing for me about this particular house. As some of you may have heard me complain about before, whether I am playing a video game or I am, watching a movie or watching a TV show, especially TV shows, right? I get so invested in the spatial relationships that are presented to us in TV shows, right? I have spent more time thinking about, the apartments in the TV show Friends than I probably should have done, honestly, because I'm trying to make sense of how these spaces fit together. It's just a thing that I do. I do it in real life too. If I go into a new environment, if I go into a new building, I'm consciously trying to unpick and figure out how these spaces interconnect, how they all work together. I'm fascinated by it. When I find environments that don't do what they're supposed to do, I find it very frustrating. That is usually a video game phenomenon, right? I'm usually exploring some kind of 3D environment in some game and being driven crazy by the fact that these places don't hook up the way that they are supposed to. They don't make a kind of realistic, rigorous sense. And of course, that's what we're presented with here in terms of the house. We also at this point get the horrifying marble sculpture, which Theodora takes to be a family portrait of sorts. We're going to circle back to some of the symbolism and the imagery found in that piece later in the book. We then eat lunch, we retire for a nap, during which time Theodora paints Eleanor's nails. So we come from this moment the night before, as Eleanor is in the firelight looking down at her own feet and thinking about how lovely they are, thinking about how perfect they are, thinking about how possessing these feet in these red sandals is quintessentially Eleanorian. And then the next day, we're painting her toes. Eleanor laughed too and held out her bare foot. After a minute, nearly asleep, she felt the odd, cold little touch of the brush on her toes and shivered. Surely a famous courtesan like yourself is accustomed to the ministrations of handmaidens, Theodora said. Your feet are dirty. Shocked, Eleanor sat up and looked. Her feet were dirty, and her nails were painted bright red. It's horrible, she said to Theodora. It's wicked, wanting to cry. Then, helplessly, she began to laugh at the look on Theodora's face. I'll go and wash my feet, she said. Golly. Theodora sat on the floor beside the bed, staring. Look, she said. My feet are dirty too, baby. Honest, look. Anyway, Eleanor said, I hate having things done to me. You're about as crazy as anyone I ever saw, Theodora said cheerfully. I don't like to feel helpless, Eleanor said. Your mother would have been delighted to see you with your toenails painted red, Theodora said. They look nice. Eleanor looked at her feet again. It's wicked, she said inadequately. I mean, on my feet, it makes me feel like I look a fool. You've got foolishness and wickedness somehow mixed up. Theodora began to gather her equipment together. Anyway, I won't take it off, and we'll both watch to see whether Luke and the doctor look at your feet first. You've got foolishness and wickedness somehow mixed up. Theodora here, I think, demonstrating a very... maybe she is just responding to that prior line. Maybe she is just directly reading the thing that Eleanor has just said. It's wicked. I mean, on my feet, it makes me feel like I look like a fool. Oh yeah, that's not wickedness. Things that make you look like a fool, that's foolishness, says Theodora, eyeing her word-a-day calendar. No, I think that what we're seeing here from Theodora instead is actually an appropriate kind of diagnosis of Eleanor, because this is what we saw in the morning. This is what was generative of her anxiety. She was worried that the night before, tired, probably drunk, right? At least a little inebriated by the fireside, she had said or done something foolish, and that would make everyone in the house hate her. It would make them turn against her. It would go from being a foolish thing into a wicked thing, that these things are on a continuum together. And as Theodora very casually points out here, a thing which is very difficult for people who have these kinds of anxiety disorders, these kinds of self-esteem issues to internalize, that is just not true. You can be as foolish as you like. Well, you know what? I'm even hesitating as I say that. I'm not sure that I completely believe that. But you can be pretty damn foolish before it turns into wickedness of any kind. But Theodora is absolutely right that Eleanor is making that comparison right there. That she is seeing these things as being continuous in a way that they are generally thought not to be. But here we see another dimension to Eleanor and Theodora's relationship, because obviously this is profoundly intimate, and obviously it is charged, right? You can see here, surely a famous courtesan like yourself is accustomed to the ministrations of handmaidens, says Theodora, and then your feet are dirty. You could interpret that as a flirtatious line. You could interpret that as something that's going beyond the sororal, going beyond the roommate to a more charged relationship here. There's something very, kinetic. But then look how we decouple this, or at least subvert it right there at the end. Anyway, I won't take it off, and we'll both watch to see whether Luke and the doctor look at your feet first. That's it. This is, even here between these two women, with the queer reading all in the background of this passage, we're still very much performing for the men. We're still, and not just performing for the men, but interested in their response. That's absolutely a key part of it. Foolishness and wickedness, these things are not the same, firstly. And secondly, they are irrelevant, because what we are interested in is not foolishness and is not wickedness, but is in fact the attention, the attraction of these men. Neither of whom, well, I was going to say neither of whom were sexually interested in, but of course that's not completely true with Luke. There is a charge, right? The first time that Eleanor sees Luke, she starts having this momentary romantic fantasy about this man, and that does kind of position him at, even the way that he's flirting, as they return from their picnic spot, and Theodora slips into this this weird and to modern eyes maybe somewhat unsettling little, we're just two little girls who got lost in the forest and we were scared by a rabbit, right? This idea that she is presenting them as vulnerable creatures for his protection, yes, but there is also obviously an implicit kind of well, I'll refer you to my discussions of the language surrounding the colonialism in the United States from the beginning of tonight's episode. So let's keep moving, because against anyone's expectations, I am now running properly late. They then retire for the evening, right, again, which carries us into the first explicitly supernatural event in the book. At least if we are going to trust Eleanor's account, then this is really happening, and it is properly supernatural. This is the something knocking, something banging on the doors, the noises in the night. Let's take a look at this slide. It had found them. Since Eleanor would not open the door, it was going to make its own way in. Eleanor said aloud, "Now I know why people scream, because I think I'm going to." And Theodora said, "I will if you will," and laughed, so that Eleanor turned quickly back to the bed, and they held each other, listening in silence. Little pattings came from around the doorframe, small, seeking sounds, feeling the edges of the door, trying to sneak a way in. The doorknob was fondled, and Eleanor, whispering, asked, "Is it locked?" And Theodora nodded, and then wide-eyed turned to stare at the connecting bathroom door. "Mine's locked too," Eleanor said against her ear, and Theodora closed her eyes in relief. The little sticky sounds moved on around the doorframe, and then, as though a fury caught whatever was outside, the crashing came again, and Eleanor and Theodora saw the wood of the door tremble and shake, and the door move against its hinges. "You can't get in," Eleanor said wildly. And again there was a silence, as though the house listened with attention to her words, understanding, cynically agreeing, content to wait. A thin little giggle came in a breath of air through the room, a little mad rising laugh, the smallest whisper of a laugh, and Eleanor heard it up and down her back, a little gloating laugh, moving past them around the house. And then she heard the doctor and Luke calling them from the stairs, and mercifully, it was over. So this is where we were going to have the conversation that we had earlier about whether or not Hill House is haunted, and if so, to what degree, in what way, what are the vectors, the mechanisms of this haunting. How does this haunting manifest itself specifically? We learned that Montague and Luke have been awake for hours, that they have been chasing this phantom dog, and that they didn't hear the disturbance in the hall, though you'll remember from right before this part of the passage that Eleanor is surprised that Theodora can hear it. For all that Eleanor does not seem to believe that this is happening in her head, but at the same time she is surprised that Theodora can hear it too. Montague speculates that the house is trying to separate the party, and that is our conclusion to chapter 4. In chapter 5, we'll accelerate just through this last part here because we're going to get to the real spooky stuff, of course. In chapter 5, Eleanor wakes happy. Everyone seems to wake happy. Eleanor has the sense of belonging. We get these beats about being oddly restored by the events of the night. And there certainly does seem to be, Montague in particular, right, as he's talking about the food tasting better than it ever has before, that there is this idea of recovery in the Tolkienian sense, right? You have been jarred out of the normal cycle of your life, of the rut in which you inevitably find yourself as a person who lives and operates in the world. You have been shaken out of it, and now you are renewed. You are restored. You are appreciating the things around you with as much clarity as possible. Montague references Balachin House again here, which we discussed last week, and then adds in, for good measure, a couple of other real haunted buildings in the British Isles. Borley Rectory in Essex, ostensibly the most haunted building in England, and Glamis Castle in Angus on the east coast of Scotland, where King Malcolm II, famous from Shakespeare's Macbeth, was in real life killed. And that building now has a reputation as a home for all kinds of spooky stories of monsters and vampires and ghosts of every sort. He was asking, or is stating here, I've always wondered what would happen if they opened the door and let it in. It's a fascinating question, and it is one which I guess in fairness, right, this is the back half to that question about what exactly is happening in Hill House. Jackson is so skillful that she can preserve the ambiguity. She can preserve the ability of the reader, the freedom of the reader to interpret these events as naturalistic as they like or as supernaturalistic as they like, right? The reader can come in and find a position on that spectrum through close reading, through analysis of the text, through an understanding of the themes as they're being presented and the world as it seems to operate. The reader can find a resting place that feels comfortable for the reader and will find relevance and applicability within the text. The text is at no point going to really lay down the hammer and say, actually, there was a ghost the whole time, and here is its name, which is, of course, the reason that the adaptations of The Haunting of Hill House have all been so free. Let's generously say that they are free adaptations. They are just completely different because you can't do this story visually. You can't represent this story on screen because the ambiguity of POV is, well, not impossible perhaps, but much more difficult to convey, particularly in an extended fashion on screen, because you are literally depicting things, right? There is an ambiguity on the page whether or not Eleanor is really experiencing these things. There's an ambiguity on the page whether or not Eleanor is really thinking the thoughts or whether she is being sincere in each and every moment. What here is performance? What here is fantasy? What here is truth? But you can't do that so freely, so readily, so easily on screen when you have to actually show a picture of the thing. You have to depict it properly right there. Again, not to say that you couldn't, but it would certainly be extremely difficult. And you know what's much easier than that? Is turning this into a haunted house story, turning this into a more conventional haunted house story, a more unambiguous haunted house story, which I believe is what all three of the major adaptations of The Haunting of Hill House have done. There's the 67 movie and the 99 movie, and then the fairly recent couple of years ago, I guess, Netflix adaptation, which is, I have read the précis of that on Wikipedia, and I will tell you that is some free adaptation happening right there. That is some loosey-goosey business right there. So that, I think, is, infinitely to Shirley Jackson's credit that she's able to preserve all of this ambiguous space, all of this interpretive space. The interpretive ability of the reader is preserved throughout, but it doesn't feel hollow. It doesn't feel, to me at least, as though there are no answers. It feels as though the answer that you arrive at yourself in your interpretation of the text is the correct one. And I'm absolutely, fascinated by that. That's a really strong thing to do. Let's take a look here as we get to Montague's discourse here the following day, as we're discussing the dangers now that we face. No physical danger exists, the doctor said positively. No ghost in all the long histories of ghosts has ever hurt anyone physically. The only damage done is by the victim to himself. One cannot even say that the ghost attacks the mind, because the mind, the conscious thinking mind, is invulnerable. In all our conscious minds, as we sit here talking, there is not one iota of belief in ghosts. Not one of us, even after last night, can say the word ghost without a little involuntary smile. No, the menace of the supernatural is that it attacks where modern minds are weakest, where we have abandoned our protective armor of superstition and have no substitute defense. Not one of us thinks rationally that what ran through the garden last night was a ghost, and what knocked on the door was a ghost. And yet there was certainly something going on in Hill House last night, and the mind's instinctive refuge, self-doubt, is eliminated. We cannot say it was my imagination, because 3 other people were there too. I could say, Eleanor put in, smiling, all 3 of you are in my imagination. None of this is real. If I thought you really believed that, the doctor said gravely, I would turn you out of Hill House this morning. You would be venturing far too close to the state of mind that would welcome the perils of Hill House with a kind of sisterly embrace. He means he would think you batty, Nell, dear. Well, Eleanor said, I expect I would be. If I had to take sides with Hill House against the rest of you, I would expect you to send me away. Why me? She wondered. Why me? Am I the public conscience? Expected always to say in cold words what the rest of them are too arrogant to recognize? Am I supposed to be the weakest, weaker than Theodora? Of all of us, she thought, I am surely the one least likely to turn against the others. A chilling thought, even represented here on the page. So the argument that Montague is making here that I referenced before is this idea that kind of echoing the idea in the opening paragraph of the book, right? If you apprehend absolute reality, you will go mad, because absolute reality is antithetical to, is incompatible with your sense of being, your sense of identity, your sense of cosmology and of metaphysics and of theology, of how the world works. The starkness of absolute reality will drive you mad. So the larks and the katydids dream. And we have the defenses of self-deception, of superstition, of self-doubt, right? The mind's instinctive refuge, self-doubt, has been eliminated because they are all there. They all witnessed some fraction of these events. Thus, they cannot, as people would be inclined to do, wake up the following morning and say, wow, what a weird dream. Obviously, I didn't really experience the things that I experienced last night. Obviously, I'm exaggerating them in my memory. Obviously, I'm pushing too far down that road. But rather here, with that defense stripped away, they have to, well, look at these ideas of superstition. Why is he so emphatic that no one believes that there's a ghost, right? In all our conscious minds, as we sit here talking, there is not one iota of belief in ghosts. Not one of us, even after last night, can say the word ghost without a little involuntary smile, because if we could say the word ghost without a smile, if we lost that shield of self-deception, of superstition, then we would go mad. That is the implication here. The only damage done is by the victim to himself. That is true physically and, it would seem, mentally here, right? Because the mind, the conscious thinking mind, is invulnerable. Or at least, right, I'm developing I'm developing Dr. Montague's arguments one step further here. He is taking as a basic premise the idea that the thinking mind is invulnerable because it cloaks itself in self-deception. But that is the counterpoint to the opening paragraph in the book, right? If you cannot do that, then you are vulnerable. And whether or not people are capable of infinite self-deception or not, I guess, is what we're going to see through the rest of the book here, right? And there is, I think, again, to lean on Jackson's not explicit and definitely not structural postmodernism here, right? But it's 1959. There's postmodernism in the air, right? We're all thinking a little bit about how stories represent themselves and how stories interact with themselves and how stories can present themselves in a particular way, can address the concerns of the reader. How that fourth wall is maybe not quite breakable. Maybe it shouldn't be broken, but it can be pressed upon, and you can certainly put post-it notes on it as direct signposts to the reader, right? Here we're getting something very much like that, I would say. We cannot say it was my imagination because 3 other people were there too. And Eleanor immediately comes in, hey, maybe you're all in my imagination. That is a possible answer to this book. That is a possible solution. That is a possible rubric that can be applied to our understanding of the text. Certainly as we move into much more sinister events here. Luke is persuaded to venture out to get more coffee. Then this is Montague again acting in contravention of his first rule, his prime directive, I almost said, which is completely appropriate, I suppose. We don't go anywhere alone, right? Is what he establishes right at the beginning of the story, and then proceeds to go alone by himself to retrieve the chess set, which he acknowledges in a very spooky moment, I think, as he comes back visibly shaken and then says, "Yeah, we're not doing that again. We travel in pairs at least." But instead, here he sends Luke off by himself, and what happens? Well, hey, it's something bad. Chilled by his face and his voice and his smile, they got up silently and followed him through the doorway into the dark, long hallway which led down to the front hall. "Here," Luke said, with a little winding shiver of Here, Luke said, and a little winding shiver of sickness went down Eleanor's back when she saw that he was holding a lighted match up to the wall. "It's Writing? Eleanor said, pressing closer to see. Writing, Luke said. I didn't even notice it until I was coming back. Mrs. Dudley said no, he added, his voice tight. My flash. The doctor took his flashlight from his pocket, and under its light, as he moved slowly from one end of the hall to the other, the letters stood out clearly. Chalk, the doctor said, stepping forward to touch a letter with the tip of his finger, written in chalk. The writing was large and straggling, and ought to have looked, Eleanor thought, as though it had been scribbled by bad boys on a fence. Instead, it was incredibly real, going in broken lines over the thick paneling of the hallway. From one end of the hallway to the other, the letters went, almost too large to read, even when she stood back against the opposite wall. Can you read it? Luke asked softly, and the doctor, moving his flashlight, read slowly, Help, Eleanor, come home. And then, of course, things deteriorate quickly. Eleanor sees herself, as she has seen herself before, as being selected, right? We just saw in that last moment. Why is she the one that is being forced to be the public conscience? Why is she being forced to say the things out loud that the others will not say? Why are they willing to fall under the self-deception that Montague is describing, whereas she is the one who has to say, hey, you might all just be figments of my imagination. I don't know. I'm crazy and you're all my puppets. I have no idea the limits of my ability to self-deceive in this moment, right? And here she's feeling it again, though in a different way. She feels that she's being selected and is thus outside of the group. She is now being alienated from this community. It's something that she has feared before, either because of her foolish decisions the night before or because of this ability, willingness, this capacity for real introspection here in these moments, or if you prefer, a kind of inclination toward disassociative behavior that is kind of taking her a little out of the reality, right? She's a little less grounded in her ability to self-deceive than Montague and the others. But here we get this isolation, this fear of isolation. Tensions rise with Theodora, particularly after we get this beat where Theodora apparently tries to anger Eleanor enough that she is shaken out of her hysteria, which is a thing that is loaded with subtext, particularly, right, loaded with peculiarly feminist subtext here, particularly when Eleanor then plays the part of forgiving her and clearly doesn't. It's tough. And it's about to be followed up. So we're going to skip ahead here. We get another night passing. We're told that they were permitted a quiet night and a quiet day and a quiet night. Then we begin the third day exploring the limits of the cold spot in the hall, engaging in some rudimentary science here. The ladies retire for a nap, only to discover that Theodora's room and clothes have been desecrated. Theodora was still sobbing wildly in her room and kicking at the wardrobe door in a tantrum that might have been laughable if she had not been holding her yellow shirt, matted and stained. Her other clothes had been torn from the hangers and lay trampled and disordered on the wardrobe floor, all of them smeared and reddened. What is it? Luke asked the doctor, and the doctor, shaking his head, said, I would swear that it was blood, and yet to get so much blood, well, one would almost have to, and then was abruptly quiet. All of them stood in silence for a moment and looked at Help, Eleanor, come home, Eleanor, written in shaky red letters on the wallpaper over Theodora's bed. This time I'm ready, Eleanor told herself, and said, You'd better get her out of here. Bring her into my room. My clothes are ruined, Theodora said to the doctor. Did you see my clothes? The smell was atrocious, and the writing on the wall was dripped and spattered. There was a line of drops from the wall to the wardrobe, perhaps what had first turned Theodora's attention that way, and a great irregular stain on the green rug. It's disgusting, Eleanor said. Please get Theo into my room. Luke and the doctor, between them, persuaded Theodora through the bathroom and into Eleanor's room, and Eleanor, looking at the red paint, it must be paint, she told herself. It simply got to be paint. What else could it be? Said aloud, But why? And stared up at the writing on the wall. Here lies one, she thought gracefully, whose name was writ in blood. Is it possible that I am not quite coherent at this moment? So this is the different Eleanor, right? Superficially composed this time, but increasingly unsettled under the surface, feeling this kinship, this identity. He was pointing out, the house is jealous. A great interpretation there, Hugh. Yes, I think that's a really strong read, that one of the ways in which we can understand the positioning of Eleanor and Theodora, as I was discussing earlier, right? As we're looking at this as a kind of a feminine dyad here, right? As we understand the relationship between the two, and we understand that there is this element of performance for the benefit of the men in the household, right? Even if that's not expressly stated, even if it's not consciously thought, it is still there nonetheless. And we're positioning the house here as being masculine, and that is an interesting tension. It's and possibly, an unexpected counterpoint here for sure. I am afraid that we are past our time and should probably be wrapping up. I mean, we're so close. You know what? Let's just push on. This scene ends with Theodora's hysteria. I would never live it down if I just wrapped up here, right? On the very brink of the material that we were supposed to cover tonight. The scene ends with Theodora's hysteria having abated. She makes her peace with the idea that she will move into Eleanor's room, share Eleanor's clothes, which, of course, if these are tokens of identity, as we've established so firmly in the beginning of tonight's reading, then what does it say when these tokens of identity are being shared, right? If Eleanor wears the red sweater, thus Theodora is the woman who is not wearing the red sweater, then what happens when Theodora wears the sweater, right? We're seeing some twinning happening here, some doubling happening here, really standard Gothic literature elements coming in, like twins, in fact, as Theodora says, right? She compares them to twins, and Eleanor corrects her, albeit in an unmarked way, recalling their conversation earlier in the book as being cousins, not twins. And the difference there is that Eleanor seems to be protecting her own identity and, by extension, her particular individual relationships. Let's move into kind of the whole point of the piece here. Oh, I've clipped the top of that slide ever so slightly. I do apologize. I think we are only afraid of ourselves, the doctor said slowly. No, Luke said, of seeing ourselves clearly and without disguise. Of knowing what we really want, Theodora said. She pressed her cheek against Eleanor's hand, and Eleanor, hating the touch of her, took her hand away quickly. I'm always afraid of being alone, Eleanor said, and wondered, am I talking like this? Am I saying something I will regret bitterly tomorrow? Am I making more guilt for myself? Those letters spelled out my name, and none of you know what it feels like. It's so familiar. She gestured to them, almost in appeal. Try to see, she said. It's my own dear name, and it belongs to me, and something is using it and writing it and calling me with it, and my own name. She stopped and said, looking from one of them to the other, even down into Theodora's face, looking up at her, look, there's only one of me, and it's all I've got. I hate seeing myself dissolve and slip and separate so that I'm living in one half, my mind, and I see the other half of me helpless and frantic and driven, and I can't stop it. But I know I'm not really going to be hurt, and yet time is so long, and even a second goes on, and I could stand any of it if I could only surrender. Surrender, said the doctor sharply, and Eleanor stared. Surrender, Luke repeated. I don't know, Eleanor said, perplexed. I was just talking along, she told herself. I was saying something. What was I just saying? She's done this before, Luke said to the doctor. I know, said the doctor gravely, and Eleanor could feel them all looking at her. I'm sorry, she said. Did I make a fool of myself? It's probably because I'm tired. Not at all, the doctor said, still grave. Drink your brandy. So here it is, right? We've been talking about identity because it turns out that identity is one of the, one of the fulcra, probably, around which this plot orients. Probably it is one of the largest kind of conceptual elements that we have to enfold. As Eleanor says here, she's now living in one, or is afraid at least, of living in one half of her mind and watching the other half. One half, my mind, and I see the other half of me helpless and frantic and driven, and I can't stop it, which is going to be, of course, so relevant later. This idea that I am who I am, and who am I? What is happening? Why am I doing what I am doing? Is going to be so completely crucial to the end of the book. And here it's being, we've built up to it, and now it's being laid out for us right here. As Hugh notes, the writing is absolutely amazing. The writing, I concur absolutely, Hugh, is just fantastic. The flow of it, the rhythm of it, the pacing of it, the characterization that's happening here. Eleanor doesn't remember, she loses track here, right? Where does she lose track? That's the important part. Am I talking like this? Am I saying something I will regret bitterly tomorrow? I think that's it. I think she comes in here with nothing to say. I think this is perhaps stimulated, we might speculate here, by this moment of knowing what we really want. Theodora said. She pressed her cheek against Eleanor's hand, right? This very intimate kind of moment of connection between the two. It's one thing for Theodora to repeatedly touch Eleanor's face, as she does. Eleanor has already noted that Theodora expresses love or expresses intimacy or affection or really any kind of personal relationship by these small fleeting touches, and here she does it again, but it might be something more than that. What are we afraid of? We're afraid of ourselves, said the doctor. No, says Luke, of seeing ourselves clearly and without disguise. I might be a bad guy, parentheses, right at the end of that, right? I might be a little bit dubious because I'm afraid of seeing myself clearly is what Luke is saying right there, or knowing what we really want. Theodora says, the queer reading is right here for us. And Eleanor hates the touch of her, not necessarily because of the queer reading, but because of this friction that is between them now, because she doesn't trust Theodora now. She takes her hand away, and then speaks. And there is an action in that moment. There is a combination of a rejection of the intimacy of the person that is right there with her, of the physical people in the room. And now suddenly she's talking without knowing if she is talking. Am I talking like this? Am I saying something I will regret bitterly tomorrow? Am I making more guilt for myself? Something is speaking through her. And it may not be the house. It may be the house, right? We might be inclined to speculate that the house now is talking, or that it is some other part of Eleanor, that it is some kind of other personality or some other aspect of her being. Again, I want to resist very much the idea here to diagnose anyone involved here. That is always a reductive, slippery slope. And then we get to this idea of surrender, right? I was just deciding where to start reading there. I hate seeing myself dissolve and slip and separate so that I'm living in one half, my mind, and I see the other half of me helpless and frantic and driven, and I can't stop it. But I know I'm not really going to be hurt, and yet time is so long, and even a second goes on, and I could stand any of it if I could only surrender. And that is when the doctor, of course, who is listening, who is absolutely paying attention, says, that's a red flag. That's a warning word right there. We should stop this. Luke also identifies it and confides in the doctor. She's done this before. Luke is also very much paying attention to what is going on with Eleanor in this moment, and by extension, throughout their experiences here. Okay. We've got one more slide to do. This is a very short slide just to finish this up here as we're thinking about identity, as we're thinking of being. We're going to get to, probably the best scare that we've had so far. The end of this chapter is just so good. We're just going to there's not really a great deal of analysis to be done here, or at least what analysis there is we'll circle back to when we have a little more information. But this is just, again, great horror writing. This is as Eleanor is now in bed holding Theodora's hand, just terrified in the darkness of their room, with the little liquid laugh and the cries and the moans. And Eleanor identifies it as a child, only to get to the end of the chapter here. Now, Eleanor thought, perceiving that she was lying sideways on the bed in the black darkness, holding with both hands to Theodora's hand, holding so tight she could feel the fine bones of Theodora's fingers. Now, I will not endure this. They think to scare me? Well, they have. I am scared, but more than that, I am a person. I am human. I am a walking, reasoning, humorous human being, and I will take a lot from this lunatic, filthy house, but I will not go along with hurting a child. No, I will not. I will, by God, get my mouth to open right now, and I will yell. I will yell. Stop it, she shouted. And the lights were on the way they had left them, and Theodora was sitting up in bed, startled and disheveled. What? Theodora was saying. What? Nell, what? God, Eleanor said, flinging herself out of bed and across the room to stand shuddering in a corner. God, whose hand was I holding? Fantastic horror writing. Great way of playing with the subjectivity of our perspective here in the text. Just really, really strong stuff, you guys. Just a great moment to wrap up our penultimate session here on The Haunting of Hill House. And hey, I made it. Against all odds, all predictions, I made it to the end of chapter 5, which leaves us with a really manageable reading for next week. Let me call up my schedule slide right here, if I can make that work. There we go. October 30th, The Haunting of Hill House, chapters 6 to 9. That is going to carry us all the way through the end of the book. And the reason that there's only one entry on this schedule slide is that I don't know what we're covering next. So stay tuned to the Patreon. If you support Next Word over on the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword, the link to which is in the show notes, then you will be able to cast your vote for the next book that we cover here on Stars and Swords. I have no idea what that book is going to be as yet. I don't even know what the topic of the unit is going to be, but it's going to be something, and it's going to be good. And that is going to be thanks to you guys. You're going to pick, I'm sure, a fascinating book for us to spend probably 6 weeks covering. I think that's the plan. We're going to spend 6 weeks on that, which carries us, believe it or not, all the way to the middle of December. And our by now traditional trip to Narnia. We're going to be looking at the third Narnia novel this Christmas time, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I really like that book, and I think that we're going to have a great deal to talk about, is basically what I'm saying with regard to that. So thank you so much for joining me here tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure, of course, spending time with Shirley Jackson, spending time in Hill House, though a little harrowing for sure. I'm going to go and, Hugh here in the chat is suggesting Ursula Le Guin, who is one of my all-time favorite writers. I know that the very dear and lovely Leslie Skipa, who is such a stalwart, such a supporter of Next Word, does not have time for Ursula Le Guin. So I might have to persuade her to do that. But yeah, I would love to cover Earthsea or one of the science fiction novels. I really do. In terms of my esteem for individual writers, Le Guin is probably like safely top 3. I think Earthsea is such an absolutely genius creation. Not just the first book, though perhaps mostly the first book, but the entire series, the entire span is so rich, so great. I was talking about it recently, in fact, as being the best books, the best series of books which has received the worst adaptations. I think that every single adaptation of Earthsea is unbelievably poor, is just unforgivably poor. But the books themselves are so fantastic. So I would love the opportunity to talk about that. So maybe I'll just put that out there. Maybe we'll see. Maybe, yeah, what would that be? Like a classics of fantasy. Maybe we could slip back into fantasy for a little bit. We've been moving around our genre space just a little. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I don't want to do fantasy right on top of Narnia. We will at some point in the very near future, Hugh, I promise you, talk about Earthsea, and we'll probably do the whole series, because why wouldn't we? It's so fantastic. That is going to do it for Stars and Swords this week. As ever, thanks to you all for listening. Thanks for joining me live here this evening, everybody. And I'll be back next Thursday. That's the night before Halloween, the Thursday the 30th. We'll be back to conclude The Haunting of Hill House and see what lies next for us on these infinite horizons of genre fiction. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I'll talk to you all again soon. Until then, take care. Good night, all.